The setting sun cast a warm amber glow over the modest suburban home, where 92-year-old John sat in his favorite armchair, his weathered hands folded neatly in his lap. The weight of his years was etched upon his face, a lifetime of experiences and memories reflected in the deep lines and wary eyes. As the front door creaked open, John's focus shifted, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. His son, Michael, had arrived for his weekly visit, a ritual they had maintained for as long as John could remember. "Dad, I'm here," Michael called out, shrugging off his coat and making his way into the living room. He paused, taking a moment to observe his father, whose expression had grown solemn. "I'm glad you came, son," John said, his voice carrying a sense of gravity that immediately caught Michael's attention. He moved closer, settling into the chair opposite his father, his brow furrowed with concern. "Is everything all right, Dad?" Michael asked, the worry evident in his tone. John let out a deep sigh, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of experiences, both joyful and sorrowful. "There's something I need to talk to you about, Michael. Something that's been weighing on my mind for a very long time." Michael leaned forward, his full attention focused on his father. John had always been a private man, preferring to keep his thoughts and emotions to himself. Moments like this, when he felt compelled to open up, were rare and significant. "You know, I don't talk about my time in the war much," John began, his gaze fixed on the worn rug beneath his feet. "But there are some things that have been haunting me, memories that I've carried with me for decades." Michael nodded slowly, encouraging his father to continue. He had heard bits and pieces of John's wartime experiences over the years, but his father had always been reluctant to delve too deeply into the details. "I've never told you about my friend Thomas," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We served together, back in the day, and we were as close as brothers. We went through hell and back, side by side, surviving battles that no man should ever have to endure." Michael listened intently, the weight of his father's words settling heavily upon him. He had known that John had experienced the horrors of war, but to hear him speak so openly about it was a rare and poignant moment. "Thomas and we made a promise to each other," John continued, his eyes finally meeting Michael's. "A promise that I've been trying to keep for all these years, but I'm running out of time." Michael felt a chill run down his spine, the gravity of the situation becoming increasingly clear. "What kind of promise, Dad?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. John took a deep, steadying breath. "Thomas and we swore that if one of us didn't make it back, the other would return to a certain place, a remote location where we had shared a moment of solace during the war. We promised to honor the memory of those we had lost, to ensure that their sacrifice would never be forgotten." Michael's heart sank as he watched the pain flicker across his father's face. He had never seen John so vulnerable, so burdened by the weight of his past. "I'm getting old, Michael," John said, his voice trembling slightly. "And I'm running out of time to fulfill that promise. That's why I need your help. I need you to go with me, to see this through, so that I can finally find the peace that's eluded me all these years." Michael felt a surge of emotions, a mixture of confusion, concern, and a deep admiration for his father's unwavering sense of duty. He knew that this was no small request, that the journey ahead would be daunting and emotional, but the resolve in John's eyes told him that this was something his father needed to do. "Of course, Dad," Michael said, reaching across the space between them to gently squeeze his father's hand. "I'm here for you, whatever you need." John's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, Michael saw a glimpse of the young, vibrant man his father once was. The weight of a lifetime seemed to lift from John's shoulders, and he nodded gratefully, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you, son," he whispered, his voice filled with a profound sense of relief. "This means more to me than you'll ever know." With that, the two men sat in a comfortable silence, the setting sun casting a warm golden glow over the room as they prepared to embark on a journey that would test the boundaries of their relationship and uncover the profound legacy of a promise made long ago. The following week, Michael arrived at his father's house, a sense of anticipation and trepidation rising within him. After their emotional conversation the previous visit, he knew that the journey ahead would be a profound one, both for himself and for his aging father. As he stepped through the door, he found John sitting in his usual chair, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. The older man's expression was a mix of apprehension and determination, a testament to the weight of the promise he had carried for so long. Dad, I'm here, Michael said, his voice soft and reassuring. He moved to take a seat opposite his father, the familiar creak of the floorboards underfoot a comforting reminder of the countless conversations they had shared in this very room. John looked up, his weathered face wrinkled in a faint smile. I'm glad you came, son, he replied, his tone laced with a sense of both relief and unease. There's something more I need to tell you about this trip we're going to take. Michael nodded, his expression attentive and open. He knew that his father had been keeping something back, a piece of the puzzle that he had yet to share. Whatever it was, Michael was prepared to listen, to support his father in the way that he had always done. You know, the war was a terrible time, full of unspeakable horrors, John began, his gaze drifting to the framed photographs that lined the mantelpiece, remnants of a life he had once lived. But there were moments, brief flashes of humanity, that helped us to keep going, to find the strength to carry on. Michael leaned forward, his eyes locked on his father's face, watching as the memories played across his features. He had heard snippets of these stories over the years, but something in John's tone suggested that this was a tale he had never before told. Thomas and I, we were in the thick of it, pinned down in a small village, surrounded by the enemy. John continued, his voice low and steady. It was chaos, pure and utter chaos, with bullets flying and explosions shaking the ground beneath our feet. Michael felt a chill run down his spine, the weight of his father's words settling heavily upon him. He could only imagine the terror and uncertainty that John and his fellow soldiers must have faced in the midst of such a brutal conflict. In the midst of all that, we stumbled upon an old man, huddled in the doorway of a crumbling building, John said, his eyes growing distant. He was terrified, his eyes wide with fear, and yet he welcomed us in, offered us shelter and a moment of respite. Michael listened, his heart swelling with a profound sense of empathy and respect for the actions of this nameless stranger. It was a stark contrast to the violence that had surrounded them, a glimmer of humanity in the face of unimaginable chaos. That moment, that small act of kindness, it changed everything for us, John continued, his voice cracking with emotion. It reminded us that even in the darkest of times, there was still good in the world, still a reason to fight and to carry on. Michael felt a lump forming in his throat, the gravity of his father's words resonating within him. He had known that John had experienced the horrors of war, but to hear him speak so openly and vulnerably about it was a humbling and profound experience. That's where Thomas and I made our promise, John said, his gaze finally meeting Michael's. We swore that if one of us didn't make it back, the other would return to that village, to that old man's doorway, and honor the memory of all those we had lost. Michael nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He understood now the weight of the burden his father had carried, the promise that had haunted him for decades. I'm running out of time, son, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I need your help to see this through, to fulfill the promise I made all those years ago. Michael reached out, grasping his father's hand in a firm, reassuring grip. I'm with you, Dad, he said, his voice laced with a determined resolve. We'll do this together, no matter what it takes. John's eyes shone with a newfound hope, and for a moment, Michael caught a glimpse of the young, vibrant man his father had once been. The weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders, and he nodded, his lips curving into a faint, grateful smile. Thank you, Michael, he whispered, the words carrying the depth of a lifetime of experience and the promise of a shared journey yet to come. The following week, Michael arrived at his father's house, a sense of apprehension and anticipation filling the air. After their emotionally charged conversations, he knew that the journey they were about to embark on would be a profound one, testing the boundaries of their relationship and uncovering the depths of a promise made long ago. As he stepped through the door, he found John waiting for him, a small leather-bound notebook clutched tightly in his weathered hands. The older man's expression was a mix of determination and trepidation, the weight of his years etched upon his face. Dad, I'm here, Michael said, his voice soft and reassuring as he made his way to the familiar armchair across from his father. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, a comforting reminder of the countless conversations they had shared in this very room. John looked up, his eyes meeting his son's with a newfound intensity. Thank you for coming, Michael, he said, his voice tinged with a sense of urgency. There's something else I need to tell you, something I've been keeping to myself for far too long. Michael nodded, his full attention focused on his father. He could sense the gravity of the situation, the weight of the unspoken words that hung in the air between them. "This notebook," John began, his fingers tracing the worn leather cover. "It's the key to the promise I made to Thomas all those years ago." He paused, taking a deep, steadying breath before continuing. "Inside these pages, I documented everything, the details of our mission, the coordinates of the village where we found that old man, and the promise we made to honor his memory." John's voice wavered, the emotion evident in his every word. Michael leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "What are you saying, Dad?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that the time has come for me to fulfill that promise," John replied, his eyes locking with his son's. "But I can't do it alone, Michael. I need your help, your support, to see this through." Michael felt a chill run down his spine, the gravity of his father's words settling heavily upon him. He had known that this journey would be a difficult one, but the revelation of the notebook and the depth of the promise it represented only served to underscore the magnitude of the task ahead. "Of course, Dad," Michael said, his voice firm and resolute. "I'm here for you, every step of the way. Whatever it takes, we'll do this together." John's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, Michael caught a glimpse of the young, vibrant man his father had once been. The weight of a lifetime seemed to lift from John's shoulders, and he nodded gratefully, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thank you, son," he whispered, his voice laced with a profound sense of relief. "I don't know how I would have made it this far without you." The two men sat in a comfortable silence, weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future hanging palpably in the air between them. Michael knew that the journey ahead would be arduous, both physically and emotionally, but he was determined to stand by his father, to help him fulfill the promise that had haunted him for so long. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the room, John reached out and gently placed the leather-bound notebook in Michael's hands. "This is where it all begins," he said, his voice filled with a sense of finality. Michael nodded, his fingers tracing the intricate stitching of the cover, the pages within holding the key to a lifetime of secrets and unspoken memories. With a deep breath, he opened the notebook, preparing to embark on a journey that would test the limits of his own resolve and uncover the profound legacy of a promise made long ago. The following morning, Michael arrived at his father's home, the leather-bound notebook tucked securely in his bag. As he stepped through the door, he found John waiting for him, his weathered face etched with a mixture of determination and trepidation. "Are you ready, son?" John asked, his voice steady, yet tinged with a hint of uncertainty. Michael took a deep breath, his gaze meeting his father's with a resolute nod. "I am, Dad. Let's do this." The two men made their way to John's old pickup truck, the engine rumbling to life as they pulled out of the driveway. The drive was a silent one, the weight of their mission hanging heavy in the air between them. After several hours, they found themselves on a winding, rural road, the landscape gradually transitioning from the familiar suburbs to a more rugged, untamed terrain. Michael glanced at his father, watching as the older man's brow furrowed with a growing sense of focus. "We're getting close," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The coordinates in the notebook are just up ahead." Michael nodded, his heart pounding in his chest as they approached a small, unassuming village. As they pulled into the narrow streets, he couldn't help but notice the skeptical, almost suspicious, glances of the locals. "What's going on, Dad?" Michael asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Why are they looking at us like that?" John let out a heavy sigh, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a palpable sense of unease. "This place, it's changed a lot since I was last here. Back then, it was a quiet, peaceful village, but it seems the world has caught up to it." Michael followed his father's gaze, taking in the weathered buildings and the wary expressions of the townspeople. Something felt off, an undercurrent of tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "We need to find the old man's house," John said, his voice low and urgent. "If we can just speak to him, explain why we're here, maybe he can help us." Michael nodded, his mind racing as they slowly navigated the narrow streets, their eyes scanning the crumbling structures for any sign of their elusive target. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, his weathered face etched with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "What business do you have here, strangers?" he called out, his voice carrying a hint of hostility. John's eyes widened, and he stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Sir, we mean you no harm." We're looking for the old man who once lived here, the one who offered us shelter during the war." The stranger's expression darkened, and he shook his head, his lips drawn into a tight, disapproving line. "The old man you speak of, he's long gone. Passed on many years ago." Michael felt his heart sink, the weight of his father's disappointment palpable in the air. He glanced at John, watching as the older man's shoulders slumped, the fire in his eyes dimming. "Then we've come too late," John murmured, his voice laced with a profound sense of regret. The stranger eyed them warily, his arms crossed over his chest. "What is it you're looking for, exactly?" he asked, his tone softening ever so slightly. John took a deep, steadying breath, his gaze meeting the stranger's with a newfound resolve. "My friend and I, we made a promise to that old man, a promise to honor the memory of those we lost during the war. We've come to fulfill that promise, to bring closure to a chapter of our lives that's haunted us for decades." The stranger's expression shifted, a flicker of understanding crossing his weathered features. He stood in silence for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought, before finally speaking. "The old man's house, it's still here. The family that lives there now, they're not fond of outsiders. If you're set on this, you'll need to tread carefully." John nodded, his eyes shining with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, sir. We'll do our best to make this right." As they made their way towards the old man's house, Michael felt a sense of dread creeping up his spine. The obstacles they faced were mounting, and he couldn't help but wonder if they were too late, if the promise his father had carried for so long would forever remain unfulfilled. But with a deep breath, he steeled his resolve, determined to stand by his father's side, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As John and Michael approached the old man's house, the weight of their mission seemed to grow heavier with each step. The streets were quiet, the locals eyeing them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, as if they were unwelcome intruders in a place that had long since moved on. John's steps were slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning the crumbling structures around them, searching for any glimmer of familiarity in the changing landscape. Michael stayed close by his father's side, a silent pillar of support, his own heart racing with a sense of unease. Finally, they stood before a modest, weathered structure, its once vibrant facade now faded and worn. John paused, his hand resting on the worn wooden door, a lifetime of memories etching across his features. "This is it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is the place." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on his father's face, watching as the older man's resolve seemed to waver, the weight of the years and the burden of his promise threatening to consume him. With a deep breath, John reached out and knocked, the sound echoing through the silent street. They waited, the seconds ticking by in agonizing silence, until the door slowly creaked open, revealing a middle-aged woman, her brow furrowed with suspicion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone wary and guarded. John stepped forward, his expression softening, though the lines of age and worry still etched deeply into his weathered face. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to intrude, but I'm looking for the old man who used to live here. I'm an old friend, and I've come a long way to see him." The woman's eyes narrowed, and she shook her head, her lips drawn into a tight, disapproving line. "I'm afraid the old man you're looking for is no longer with us. He passed away several years ago." Michael watched as his father's shoulders slumped, the weight of disappointment and regret etching across his features. He knew how much this journey had meant to the older man, how the promise he had made all those years ago had become a lifeline, a way to find closure and peace. "I see," John murmured, his voice tinged with a profound sense of sorrow. "I had hoped to." He trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air between them. The woman studied him for a moment, her expression softening ever so slightly. "I'm sorry, but the old man's house, it's been in my family for generations. We don't take kindly to strangers poking around, even if they claim to be old friends." John nodded, his gaze drifting to the worn, weathered steps leading up to the doorway, a lifetime of memories etched into the worn wood. "I understand," he said, his voice laced with resignation. "We've come a long way, but it seems we're too late." Michael placed a gentle hand on his father's shoulder, his own heart heavy with the weight of their disappointment. "Dad, we can still try to find another way," he said, his voice low and reassuring. But John shook his head, his eyes distant and filled with a profound sense of regret. "No, son, I'm afraid this is where our journey ends." As they turned to leave, the woman hesitated, her expression shifting ever so slightly. "Wait," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it's truly that important to you, maybe there's another way we can help." John and Michael turned back, their eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. The woman's gaze darted around the street, as if she were afraid of being overheard, before she beckoned them closer. "There's an old man, a neighbor of ours, who knew the previous owner well. He might be able to help you, if you're willing to take the risk." John's eyes widened, and he nodded, his hand reaching out to grasp the woman's in a gesture of gratitude. "We are, ma'am. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." As they made their way down the street, a newfound sense of determination filled the air. The obstacles they faced were mounting, but John's resolve had only grown stronger, fueled by the hope that he might finally be able to fulfill the promise that had haunted him for so long. John and Michael made their way down the narrow, winding streets, their eyes scanning the crumbling structures for any sign of the neighbor the woman had mentioned. The air was thick with tension, the wary glances of the locals serving as a constant reminder of the obstacles they faced. As they approached a modest, well-kept home, John paused, his gaze fixed on the weathered door. "This must be the place," he murmured, his voice tinged with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Michael nodded, his hand resting lightly on his father's shoulder, offering silent support. "Are you ready, Dad?" he asked, his voice low and reassuring. John took a deep, steadying breath and stepped forward, his knuckles rapping against the wooden door. They waited, the seconds ticking by in agonizing silence, until the door slowly creaked open, revealing an elderly man, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you want?" The man growled, his voice gruff and unwelcoming. John cleared his throat, his posture straight and his expression earnest. "Sir, we're looking for information about the old man who used to live in the house down the street. The woman there said you might be able to help us." The elderly man's brow furrowed, and he eyed them warily, his gaze darting between the father and son. "What business is it of yours?" he snapped, his tone laced with hostility. Michael felt a surge of unease, his heart racing as he watched his father's expression shift. The older man's shoulders had slumped, the weight of his years and the burden of his promise etching across his features. "Please, sir," John said, his voice soft and pleading. "My friend and we made a promise to that old man, a promise we've been trying to keep for decades. We've come a long way, and we're running out of time. If there's any way you could help us." The elderly man's expression softened ever so slightly, and he studied John's weathered face for a long moment, as if searching for the truth in his words. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "Come in, then," he muttered, his tone gruff but no longer laced with the same level of suspicion. John and Michael exchanged a glance, a flicker of hope igniting within them as they followed the elderly man into his modest home. The interior was sparse, but well-kept, and John couldn't help but feel a sense of familiarity in the worn wooden furnishings. "The old man you're looking for, his name was Ezra," the elderly man began, his gaze fixed on the two visitors. "He was a good man, always willing to lend a hand to those in need." John nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's him. That's the man we're looking for. Can you tell us more about him? About what happened to him?" The elderly man let out a heavy sigh, his expression somber. "Ezra passed away a few years ago. God rest his soul. He never married, never had any family to speak of, but he was beloved by this entire community." Michael watched as his father's shoulders slumped, the disappointment evident in his features. He reached out, his hand grasping John's in a gesture of comfort and support. "I'm sorry, son," John murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It seems we've come too late." But the elderly man raised his hand, his expression shifting with a hint of understanding. "Wait, there's more. You said you made a promise to Ezra, didn't you?" John's head snapped up, his eyes widening with a glimmer of hope. Yes, that's right. We promised to return here, to this very place, to honor the memory of those we lost during the war." The elderly man nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Well, then, it seems you've come to the right place after all. Ezra, he kept a journal, full of memories and stories from his life. Maybe there's something in there that could help you fulfill your promise." As the elderly man disappeared into the next room, John and Michael exchanged a glance, their hearts racing with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. The obstacles they had faced were daunting, but the possibility of finding Ezra's journal, of finally being able to honor the promise they had made all those years ago, filled them with a renewed sense of purpose. As the elderly neighbor disappeared into the next room, John and Michael exchanged a weighted glance, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The possibility of finding Ezra's journal, the key to unlocking the promise they had made decades ago, felt both exhilarating and daunting. The moments that followed seemed to stretch on, the silence in the modest home punctuated only by the creaking of floorboards and the muffled sounds of the elderly man's rummaging. John shifted in his seat, his weathered hands gripping the armrests of the chair, his eyes fixed on the doorway, willing the neighbor to return with the precious journal. Finally, the elderly man emerged, a small, leather-bound book clutched in his weathered hands. He approached the two visitors, his expression guarded, yet tinged with a hint of understanding. "This was Ezra's," he said, his voice low and gruff. "He kept it hidden, away from prying eyes, but I think he would have wanted you to have it." John let out a shaky breath, his trembling fingers reaching out to reverently take the journal from the neighbor's hands. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to us." The elderly man nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment on the two men before him. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, his tone softening ever so slightly. Michael placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder, his own heart swelling with a mix of hope and trepidation. "We'll be careful with it, sir," he said, his voice steady and sincere. As the elderly neighbor ushered them to the door, John paused, his eyes scanning the worn, weathered facade of the home, his mind no doubt racing with memories of a time long past. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for everything." The neighbor simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and with that, John and Michael stepped out into the quiet street, the leather-bound journal clutched tightly in the older man's hands. They made their way back to their truck in silence, the weight of their mission bearing down on them with each step. As they settled into the worn seats, John ran his fingers over the journal's cover, his brow furrowed with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. "Are you ready, Dad?" Michael asked, his voice low and reassuring. John took a deep, steadying breath and nodded, his eyes filled with a resolute determination. "Yes, son, let's see what Ezra's journal has to tell us." As they pored over the weathered pages, the stories and memories within unfolding like a tapestry, a sense of awe and reverence washed over them. Ezra's words, written in a steady, beautiful script, painted a vivid picture of the man they had come to honor, his kindness, his resilience, and the profound impact he had made on the lives of those around him. But buried within the pages, they'd also found something they had not expected, a map, a set of coordinates that led to a remote, secluded location, far from the village they had just visited. "This must be it, Dad," Michael said, his voice tinged with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, "the place where you and Thomas made your promise." John nodded, his weathered fingers tracing the faded lines on the map, a lifetime of memories flickering across his features. "Yes, son, this is where it all began. This is where we need to go." As they started the truck and pulled away from the village, the weight of their task seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. The obstacles they had faced, the skepticism and hostility of the locals, had only served to underscore the importance of their mission, the profound legacy they were determined to honor. But with a renewed sense of purpose, John and Michael pressed on, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their hearts and minds united in a single, unwavering goal, to fulfill the promise that had haunted them for decades, and to finally find the peace that had so long eluded them. As John and Michael drove through the winding, rural roads, the landscape gradually transforming from the familiar suburban streets to a rugged, untamed terrain, the weight of their mission seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. The map they had found in Ezra's journal had led them to a remote, secluded location, far from the village they had visited, and the closer they drew to their destination, the more the air began to crackle with a sense of unease and uncertainty. Michael glanced sideways at his father, whose weathered face was etched with a mixture of determination and trepidation. The older man's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles turning white, as if he were steeling himself for the challenges that lay ahead. "Dad," Michael said, his voice low and reassuring, "are you sure about this? We can turn back, if you need to." John hesitated for a moment, his gaze fixed on the winding road before them. "No, son," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "We've come this far. I need to see this through, no matter what." Michael nodded, his own resolve hardening. He knew that his father's promise, the one he had made to his old friend Thomas all those years ago, had become a lifeline, a way to find closure and peace in the wake of the horrors they had witnessed during the war. As they turned off the main road and onto a narrow, barely visible path, the landscape grew more rugged and inhospitable, the trees and brush seemingly closing in around them. Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, a nagging suspicion that they were venturing into territory that was no longer welcoming to outsiders. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, their features obscured by the thick foliage. John slowed the truck to a halt, his heart pounding in his chest, and Michael felt his own hand instinctively reach for the door handle, his body tensing in anticipation of a confrontation. But as the figure drew closer, they recognized the familiar face of the elderly neighbor, the one who had given them Ezra's journal. The man's expression was a mix of trepidation and understanding, and he raised a weathered hand in a gesture of greeting. "I thought you might be coming this way," the elderly man said, his voice low and cautious. "The locals, they're not too fond of strangers poking around these parts." John nodded, his gaze scanning the surrounding area, his mind no doubt racing with memories of the past. "We know the risks, sir," he said, his voice tinged with a sense of urgency. "But we have to see this through, for Thomas, and for Ezra." The elderly man studied them for a moment, his brow furrowed with a hint of concern. "Then you'll need my help," he said, his tone resolute. "The path ahead is treacherous, and the locals, they won't take kindly to your presence." Michael felt a surge of relief, his eyes meeting the elderly man's with a silent expression of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As they continued their journey, the elderly neighbor leading the way, Michael couldn't help but marvel at the unwavering determination that burned within his father's eyes. John, a man who had carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of memories and regrets, seemed to have been transformed, his steps quickened by a sense of purpose that Michael had never witnessed before. It was as if the promise he had made all those years ago, the one that had haunted him for decades, had become a beacon, guiding him through the darkness and uncertainty that surrounded them. And in that moment, Michael knew that he would do whatever it took to help his father fulfill that promise, to honor the memory of the men they had lost and to find the peace that had so long eluded them.